Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today I'm out at Duelist Den. And today I'm going to answer the question, who carried a sword in the Middle Ages? So, who carried swords in the Middle Ages? Well, let me give you the answer in the back of the book, in case you don't want to go through the whole explanation. Because the answer is anyone who thought they needed a sword and who could also afford a sword. And that's pretty simple. Now, the thing is, both of those criteria had to be met. But the relative ability to meet them changed over the course of the Middle Ages. And that should be no surprise to anyone. You know, we tend to think of swords as knightly weapons. But for the first half of the Middle Ages, knights didn't even exist. The truth is, swords are basically military weapons. They're basically offensive, more so than a knife. They are used in the attack. Now they have defensive capabilities as well, which is important. But we're going to find swords as implements of war, or of the close relatives of war, shall we say, keeping order and discipline. So police actions, enforcing the will of the ruler. So those are the kind of things that we're going to find swords used for throughout the Middle Ages. And different people are going to have different reasons for having swords. And as economics changed and as the political landscape changed, that tended to change as well. There's a real problem with making broad generalizations about what happened or how people behaved in the Middle Ages. And that's because the Middle Ages took up an immense amount of time. It was 1,000 years. So think about how different the world was in 1021 AD from the way it is now in 2021 AD, right? Well, it was quite different in 476 AD than it was in 1450 AD. So that's generally, the Middle Ages is counted as the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor in 476 AD to the fall of Byzantium to the Turks in the 1450s. I think in 1454, but I could be off by a couple of years. But anyway, that 1,000 years. So culture changed tremendously over that 1,000 years. The other thing to remember is Europe as a continent takes up 3.9 million square miles. Or for my non-American viewers, that's almost 11 million square kilometers. Right? Obviously, the culture was quite different in Russia than it was in Spain. And you can make some broad generalizations, but most of them are going to fail. So, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to mostly focus on England and the culturally related areas of northern France during the Middle Ages. And we're going to talk about who carried a sword during those time periods. And I think some of it might surprise you. All right, well, the Dark Ages in Britain and in the rest of Europe, for that matter, were an incredibly violent age. The Roman Empire was being taken apart. Migrating peoples were carving up the landscape for their own use. The native peoples, formerly Romans, generally resisted. And things were in a pretty fluid state. And there was no class barrier to owning a sword. If you could get your hands on a sword and you needed one, you were going to use one. And that actually remained true for the entire Middle Ages. And I'm going to have to talk about this, I think, right up front, and just get it out. A lot of people think that there were class-based restrictions on owning swords. In other words, that only the gentry, the nobility and the knightly and squire class, were allowed to own swords. That there were laws and customs that kept the hoi polloi from owning swords. And that is not true as far as I can determine. I mean, I hear people make those broad statements, and some people I respect, but in researching sword laws in the Middle Ages, which I have done, I don't find class as a barrier to sword ownership. And I'm just going to get that out of the way right up front. Most of the sword laws that I see in place, and I'm going to put some right here. I'm going to flash them up on the screen for about 2 seconds each. And if you're actually interested, use your pause button and you can read them at your leisure. But I'm only going to put them up for a couple of seconds. So I'm going to put up several of them. Most of the sword laws that I can find barely mention class at all. And it's pretty obvious that what they are aimed at is not controlling the ownership of weapons by the lower classes. They don't really seem to care. What they're concerned with is limiting the amount of violence. Okay, so they don't want swords being carried on the streets of London after dark, because anybody who's likely to be doing that is doing it to kill and rob people. Right? So that's what they're trying to stop. They don't want, let's say, apprentices and journeymen carrying swords around in the city, not because they're not members of the gentry, but because they have a bad habit of getting into riots. If you saw gangs of New York, well, just translate that back to the Middle Ages, because what you often had were apprentices from different guilds. And in London, I should point out, and a lot of independent communes, okay, we're not talking about villages, but we're talking about chartered independent communes that ran their own governments. Because they weren't run by the nobility per se, to defend themselves, they had what were called trained bands. All right, and that would be made up of citizens. You could think of it as a militia. And it was generally the younger guys, the apprentices and the journeymen. And they actually trained as men-at-arms so that the city of London could raise its own forces, let's say if they got ticked off with King Richard, you know, which certainly happened, or with anybody. They didn't want the Empress Maud moving in and taking over if they liked Stephen a little bit more, right? So they would have their own fighters. And for lack of anything better to do, those guys like to go out and just beat the crap out of each other on any given Tuesday. And the authorities didn't like that. They wanted to control it. So a lot of the sword laws were specifically aimed at reducing crime. And occasionally they were aimed at protecting, say, a ruler like Richard II, who was decidedly unpopular, from having anybody around him besides his bully boys that had weapons. Right? So it didn't matter if you were a member of the gentry or not. Now, in some cases, they would make an exception in the sword laws for members of the gentry. But basically, that was more because if they didn't, they would find themselves with a problem. But they would generally limit it to the nobility and their squires, and not all of their men-at-arms. So, you know, you could show up, you know, Earl Jack with a sword, or with your squire carrying your sword, not even wearing it, just carrying it. But we don't want all your men-at-arms coming in town carrying weapons, because they're afraid they would try to take over. Right? So that's how these things went. So there was no real bar to owning a sword based on class. Right? The bar to owning a sword was based on finances. And that's what I think we need to talk about. All right, like I said, in Dark Age Britain, or the rest of the Middle Ages for that matter, a person was going to own a sword if he thought he needed a sword and if he could afford it. And the affording part was quite different at different points in history. Now, the earliest information that I've got on the cost of a sword in the Middle Ages goes back to the Carolingian period. So we're talking the 9th century. And in Charlemagne's empire, the cost of a sword and scabbard was 7 solidi coins, solidius, I guess you'd say. And that was a gold coin of the Roman Empire, roughly equivalent to the Byzantine bezant. All right, very small gold coin. It had about 4.5 grams of gold in it, which is more money than a lot of people would see, you know, in their lifetime. So, saying that a sword costs 7 solidus, 7 solidi, that doesn't really say much, right? But it's always kind of tricky to try to equate, you know, money in the past to money today for just a lot of reasons. Because the relative cost of goods is quite different. I mean, some things now would be considered incredibly cheap by medieval standards, as far as how much of your income they take up, right? Just incredibly cheap. I mean, food is one thing, very, very cheap. And then there are so many things that they didn't have then that we have now that we spend money on, that to look at, say, an annual income now versus then and say, well, this is, you know, if this is what a worker makes now and they made this then, that's roughly equivalent. Well, it's really not. So I'm going to take a look at this a couple of different ways. And this is a little bit complicated, but if a solidus coin was worth 4.5 grams of gold, well, the date I looked this up, a gram of gold was worth $86. Okay? So, at 7 solidi, the current value of a sword and scabbard would be $2,700. So we're talking in the Albion sword range there, right? Not cheap today, and certainly not cheap back in the day. Okay? Now I'm going to give you another way of looking at it, and this is kind of mixing periods, so it gets a little bit tough. But if we take an English guinea coin, which is about the same as a current British sovereign, that's got 8.3 grams of gold in it. So basically 2 solidi coins to a guinea. Now when a guinea was established, it was worth £1, 1 shilling. Okay, and a lot of unscrupulous people would price things in guineas because it would sound cheaper than pounds, and they're so close to the same thing, but they're really not. Right? So, if 1 guinea is worth £1, 1 shilling, and there are 240 pennies to the pound, and 12 pennies to the shilling, and I got to read this because it's too complicated for me to memorize. So a 7 solidi sword and scabbard cost 882 silver pennies. Now the reason I'm doing it this way is because the only actual currency floating around in the early Middle Ages was the silver penny. Everything else was just a currency of account. There were no £1 coins or guinea coins, and I don't think anybody had a solidi for years. By the time the Carolingian Empire rolled around. After the Crusades, there were some bezants around. But you wouldn't have had those larger gold coins for the most part. All actual transactions were done in pennies. So 882 pennies, that's the cost of a sword. So, in the year 1300, because we've got some data for this, an unskilled laborer earned 480 pennies a year. And so we can guess that in the year 800, right, during the Carolingian times, they probably made less than 480 pennies a year. But even if they made the same. So in the year 800, that 882 silver penny sword was 2 years' wages for an average working man. So there weren't very many average working men who were going to own a sword, period. It just was not going to happen. So our Anglo-Saxon buddy, let's say he's a fairly low-level farmer, but he's a member of the Fyrd, which would be basically the entire host of the countryside. When he showed up to fight the Vikings, he didn't have a sword. He would have had one of these. Right? Very useful, nice long handy spear. And for close-up work, he would have had one of these, a sax. So he got the spear for most of his fighting work, and then he's got his sax, right, for when things get up close and personal. And that is what he is likely to carry. And I gotta say, as a big fan of the show Vikings, which I am, I always thought it was odd that they always fought, Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, duked it out with shields, armor, swords, and axes, right? And sometimes I wish I could kind of drop in to Alfred's palace and say, hey, Your Majesty, I got an idea. Why don't we get some long spears, and when those Vikings show up and they run at us with their axes and swords, why don't we stand back there and just poke them from a distance before they can get to us? Because that would have made a lot of sense. But that was not as much fun for the TV guys, I guess. But our lower class Anglo-Saxon buddy would have showed up with one of these. And if he was lucky enough to loot a sword off of the battlefield, right, which would have looked like this, well, he probably wouldn't have kept it. Because if he could sell this thing for 400 pennies, he could buy a draft horse, and he could rent a couple more strips of land, and really improve his lot in life way more than a sword is going to improve it. So he would have sold this thing off in a heartbeat, right, and would have used this. So you wouldn't have found very many lower class guys carrying one of these in the Anglo-Saxon times. Well, at the other end of Anglo-Saxon society, the gentries were known as thanes. And in order to qualify to be a thane, you had to own more than 5 hides of land. And a hide was defined as enough land to support a family of farmers. So a hide could vary depending on where it was in the country, depending on how productive the soil was. Right now, nominally, a hide was expected to generate 1 pound of income. So a low-level thane would have about 1,500 pennies of income a year. And therefore, a sword would represent about half a year's income for a low-level thane. So I would posit that many low-level thanes did not own swords. In fact, they would have been better served showing up with an axe, which we know Anglo-Saxons were fond of. They picked it up from the Danes, and this is something that I would say a low-level thane would be carrying as his sidearm, along with a spear, shield, all that good stuff. Now, if a low-level thane was lucky enough to loot a sword off of the battlefield, he'd probably keep it, right? Because that would be something that he would consider as enhancing. And it would be a sword that would probably look like this, which is an oak shot type 10 blade, you know, a broad-folded blade, small hilt, crossguard, T-cozy pommel. Right? This is the sort of sword that we would have found in Anglo-Saxon England and all over Western Europe. They're really Frankish swords. But a high-level thane would have had much more income, say an earl or earldoman, and they would have been able to afford a sword without any problem, and they might have had several of them. So that's the way things would have been in Dark Age England. Now, as we get to the 14th century, the economics changed quite a bit from the Dark Ages. And by the 14th century, the European economy had recovered almost to the level of the 4th century Roman Empire. So amazingly, it took almost 1,000 years for economic activity to return to the levels it had in Roman times. And in some areas, the late medieval economy surpassed the Roman economy. And one area that was booming was weapons manufacture. Steel was better, manufacturing techniques were better, and a cheap sword, which that didn't exist in the early Middle Ages, but a cheap sword in the 14th century only cost 6 pennies. So that was 3 days labor for an average working man, and for a soldier, not that much at all. Right? So as a result, sword ownership in the 14th century was actually a lot more widespread than it had been in the 9th century. So that really addresses one half of the equation of who carried a sword, right? It addresses the who could afford it half of the equation, which expanded greatly in the 14th century. But we still have the question of who thought they needed a sword. And obviously more people who thought they needed a sword would be able to afford a sword in the 14th century than they could in the 13th century. So, who thought they needed a sword in the 14th century? Well, once again, I'm going to turn to the Canterbury Tales, because that gives a really good cross-section of European society towards the end of the 14th century. And even though Chaucer could exaggerate some things, even though clearly some of the tales are unrealistic, in every practical sense, if he was off the mark, he had an audience that would raise the BS flag. So I think we can trust him in terms of what he tells us in regard to weapons. And certainly he had been around. I mean, he had done diplomatic work for the crown. He had traveled widely across Europe. He was well known to the gentry, but he certainly understood the commoners as well. So let's take a look at what Chaucer says about who is carrying weapons in the Canterbury Tales. So there are 29 pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. And of those, Chaucer is silent on the arms of 16 of them. Just doesn't mention them. Now, as we always say, lack of evidence doesn't mean there wasn't a crime committed. Well, lack of mentioning weapons doesn't mean that there weren't weapons. And that's certainly true. In this case, we only know what Chaucer's telling us, we don't know what he's not telling us. And the reason I think that that's fairly obvious, that there are some things missing, are the only knives he talks about are for the 5 guildsmen, right? And he only mentions their knives because they have silver fittings as opposed to the more common brass fittings like I have on my knife. But we know that in the Middle Ages, everyone carried a knife. It's how you ate your food, right? If you went to dinner somewhere, whether it was at an inn or even a fancy palace, you didn't get silverware. You were expected to show up with your knife, and that's what you used to eat with. So we know everybody there had a knife, not just those 5 rich guildsmen. But he only mentions the knives on the guildsmen because he had a reason for it. And that's the way he probably is on a lot of these weapons. But we can only take what he tells us. So let's take a look at that. Now he mentions daggers specifically twice. He mentions it for the franklin and for the shipman. And a franklin is basically a wealthy commoner, a farmer who owns or rents enough land to be quite well-to-do, even though he is not actually a member of the gentry. But we find him carrying a dagger for his defensive purposes. And that would have been very common. I mean, a lot of people who couldn't afford a sword could afford a big knife, right? And big knives have always been popular for putting between people's ribs if they get out of line. So we've got those two. We've got the sailor. So we have those two carrying daggers, the shipman, the sailor, and the franklin carrying daggers. It's not mentioned for anybody else, but undoubtedly other people had them because it was quite common. So we've got to take that on board. Now when it comes to swords, two of the people who are not mentioned are people that we can be sure had swords, because Chaucer is silent about the weapons for the knight and his squire, and it's almost inconceivable that they would not have had swords. So this sword, the long sword, is an oak shot type 18. It's got a diamond cross section, kind of pointy, though it should be a little bit more pointy. This is not a fine name brand sword. I picked this up because I wanted a long sword, but I'm not particularly fond of them, so I just wanted an example sword. But Chaucer's knight would probably have had a sword like this instead of an arming sword, because the advantage of this is he can fight on horseback one-handed, sword and shield. It's very effective for that. He could also fight with it two-handed on foot. So that is a huge advantage for these hand-and-a-half swords. The first person Chaucer specifically mentions as carrying a sword is the Knights Yeoman. And he is a professional soldier, like the knight, though a commoner. He's an archer. And he is very well armed, and he probably would have come from the knight's estate. In fact, the knight probably had a company of archers with him when he entered into the service in the 100 Years' War. So, how's the knight armed? Well, by his side, he has a sword and a shield, according to Chaucer. Now, in this case, we can be pretty sure that the shield is a buckler, because we know archers carried bucklers. And these are quite effective, and he could have tied it to his belt and had it ready all the time, right? So, very effective at parrying blows. Now, what sort of sword would he have had? Probably this type of sword, an arming sword, not a two-handed sword, because he's already got to carry a 6-foot bow, a sheaf of arrows. He's got a lot going on. But arrows are good when they're far away, but eventually the French are right up close, and you need a sharp pointy thing to keep them from getting in your face. And he would have carried a sword like this. This is an oak shot type 18, like the knight's sword, except it's shorter. It's an arming sword. This one has an S-shaped hilt, crossguard, disc pommel. It is extremely light and handy because it's got a lot of taper to the blade, so it makes it very responsive, and it's absolutely perfect for piercing mail, and that's what this was designed for. So that point will get right into a ring of mail, and if you hit it hard enough, it's going to bust that ring apart and pierce the person on the other side. Right now, it also is still an effective cutting sword for lightly armored opponents, and plate was becoming more prevalent then, and this is a type of sword that can find the junction between plates and get between them. So this is what was favored by the foot soldiers during the 14th century, and this is probably what our archer would have been carrying. And it's an excellent weapon. Now he also, according to Chaucer, had a dagger, needle sharp. And this served the same function. This is a quill and dagger. These things were popular for, Christ, like 1,000 years. But that acute point meant that you could get up close and you could jab that through mail if you could hit hard enough. Or you could find the joint in an armor, or you could find the eye slit and put them out that way. So this was carried by a lot of knights as well, because once you got close, that two-handed longsword, no good anymore. You're basically wrestling and trying to stick one of these in to any spot that you could. So this would have been the yeoman's weaponry. So the next person Chaucer describes as having a sword is the miller. And millers were pretty much universally despised during the Middle Ages, because it was assumed that every miller was a crook. And they might not all have been crooks, but boy, you might as well be, because everybody thinks you are. So everybody assumes that the miller is robbing them of some of their flour when he grinds their grain, and he probably was. And they also resented millers because most millers were in partnership with the lord of the manor. And the lord of the manor would generally pony up the money, or if not the money, the location for the mill, because it was going to have to be on a mill stream, unless it was a windmill. And he would require all of the peasants on his estate to grind their grain at his mill, right? So, and then he would split the profits with the miller. And that was hugely unpopular with people, because of course they had a monopoly, they could charge whatever they wanted. So millers were despised. So Chaucer said that he had nostrils black and wide, and he bore a shield and a sword by his side. So he undoubtedly was also carrying a buckler. He would not have carried a full-size shield. And bucklers were very popular for hundreds of years for, say, bravo boys, or for anybody who was wandering around town with a sword, didn't want to have a big shield, but felt that they needed a sword for protection, maybe members of the watch, or just the bully boys that you would find in any group of apprentices. So maybe the miller was carrying a Type 18 as well if he was up to date. He probably would have had a sword like this, but it could have been an older sword. One never knows. We just know he was carrying a sword. And the final person mentioned by Chaucer as carrying a sword is the Reeve. And Reeves were basically the first level of management on an estate. So they made sure that that the peasants, the serfs, were putting in their allotted time on the Lord's fields, or turning in their rent, or any of the various and sundry indignities that they had to do. And this is quite a problem, because for a lot of peasants, they might have had to have worked 2 or 3 days a week on the Lord's fields, and then the rest of the time on theirs, right? So that's time that they're losing on being able to run their own farms. And that's a lot of time. It's pretty expensive. So the Reeve was not always a popular guy. And quite often he was seen as cheating both sides of the house. He was cheating the lord and cheating the peasants. Not to say that there weren't plenty of honest Reeves, I'm sure there were, but they could have a bad rep. And it said, Chaucer says he had a long blue surcoat, and by his side he had a rusty blade. So maybe he had a blade of an earlier generation than the Type 18. This is an Oakshot Type 14 blade. It also is very pointy. It still would have been quite useful at the end of the 14th century, even though this is more of a 13th century to early 14th century blade. But it's also designed to be stiff enough to pierce mail. So for our pilgrims, they are not likely to be dealing with plate-armored knights. They're likely to be dealing with highwaymen, ruffians. They might have mail coats, they might not. So they're likely to be more lightly armored, and a sword like this would be very effective for them. So because it was rusty, we know it was not cared for, that he's not really a fighting man, but he felt like he had to have one with him. and it may have been a little bit older as well as being rusty, so this Type 14 would probably have fit the bill very well, and they are excellent swords. So that's what the Pilgrims were carrying. Well, let's look at what we learned. If Chaucer can be believed, and I think he can, then we got a whole lot of sword use by people who are not members of the gentry. Right? We've got millers, we've got Reeves, certainly we have knights, squires, soldiers, all using swords as you'd expect. But then we've got absolute commoners who are not military using them, and the key is that they could afford them. Those were gentlemen that had a little more disposable income. Well, I shouldn't say gentlemen, because technically I guess they weren't in the medieval sense of gentlemen, but they had more disposable income. They could afford to buy a sword, and they thought they needed one because they were going to be traveling the dangerous roads to Canterbury. That brings us to our conclusion, right, or my conclusion of who carried a sword in the Middle Ages. Anybody who needed one who could afford one. And that's a lot more people than we think. So, I hope that you enjoyed this. It's a little bit different for me. I know it's a lot of talky, but it's a subject that I find pretty interesting. If you did too, give it a thumbs up. That helps us with the algorithm, as you know. And if you're not a subscriber to the channel, I hope you'll subscribe. There'll be more sword content coming up, but of course if you're familiar with the channel, you know most of what I do is historical firearms type stuff. And there's a lot more of that coming up too, so if you like that, you get to see plenty of that. And you'll see some more sword stuff. I think I'm going to have something coming up on throwing axes and Viking axes before the end of the summer, so if that interests you, you'll be able to see that. I've got an Albion sword that I'll be doing a review on. So that's the sword stuff that's coming up. And there's plenty of flintlock and Captain Ball revolver stuff on the horizon as well. So if you like all that stuff, subscribe. That way you won't miss any. There's a lot more content over on my website, MikeBeliveau.com, mostly dedicated to muzzle loading. So go check that out if you're interested in that. And if you want to support the channel on Patreon, I would certainly appreciate it. But if you can't or you won't, that's fine too. We're just happy to have you come here and watch the videos. That's why I make them. So until next week, bye.